This is KM Wyland, and you are listening to the 376th episode of the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. This has been a nose to the grindstone kind of week for me. I've kept busy transcribing the last of my scene outline for my Portal Fantasy sequel Dreambreaker from my handwritten notes into Scrivener using the speech-to-text dictation software Dragon Naturally Speaking, which I highly recommend for anyone who has to deal with transcribing huge chunks of text. I also completed the first draft of the Creating Character Arcs workbook and got down to work with the first couple rounds of proofreading. Hoping to finish that this coming week so I can then start figuring out what helpful infographics I can add to the workbook before I start in on the digital version, which is always a challenge of its own in comparison to the print version of the workbooks. So, keeping busy. In other news, I'm pleased to announce that for those of you who find it more efficient and helpful to listen rather than read from a book, the much requested Creating Character Arcs audiobook is now available from both Amazon and Audible. So I hope you'll check that out. And now I hope you enjoyed this week's podcast entitled Most Common Writing Mistakes, Part 57, Dead End Relationships. Once upon a time, there were two characters. They got along very well, cared for each other very much, always had good advice for one another, and always had each other's back. The end. Oh yeah, and even though it's hardly worth mentioning, there was also this subplot character who once betrayed one of the main characters, even though he loved her, and even though he only did it because his conscience demanded he do it. Main character number 1, who we'll say is a tough young woman orphaned in wartime, just happens to be haunted by this minor subplot character, thinks about him all book long, and is constantly talking about him to main character number 2, who we'll say is a crusty old military buddy of her dad's, who has stepped in as a beloved father figure. But this is a subplot character, remember? So mostly that's all they do, talk about it. What's really important is this nice little relationship between tough orphan girl and her loving mentor. Or is it? Seriously, which of these relationships sounds more interesting? We could even reverse the romance angle. The girl has a happy romantic relationship with her supportive husband, but she's haunted by the father figure who betrayed her. Still looks to me like that intriguing little subplot relationship is way more interesting than the super duper, happy dappy, ideal relationship on which this book keeps trying to focus all its attention. So what does this mean? That your character should never have healthy relationships? That healthy relationships are never going to be interesting to readers? Certainly not. But what it does mean is that if your story is trying to focus on a dead-end relationship, you may be missing out on some of your story's best opportunities for entertaining readers and deepening themes. A dead-end relationship is one that doesn't ask questions and doesn't evolve over the course of the story. It's static. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that, since not every relationship in a story needs to be dynamic. Most protagonists will require a support system of sorts, like our tough girl hero and her generalissimo father figure. These may be mentor or sidekick characters who offer the protagonist feedback about her problems and advice about how to make forward progress through the plot. But you simply will not have space, either within the exploration of theme or the actual word count, to turn all of these relationships into something deeper. As a result, they will be comparatively shallow relationships. These characters probably won't be following thematic arcs of their own, and they will exist primarily to provide contrast and direction as the protagonist navigates the choppy waters of more interesting relationships. And right there, you can see the problem with dead-end relationships in a nutshell. However nice they may be, they're simply not very interesting. Now, relationships are the heart and soul of fiction. By no small coincidence, this is because relationships are the heart and soul of the human experience. Even for the most introverted among us. Our lives are defined, limited, expanded, enriched, and endangered by all the other people bumping in and out of our spheres of existence. Even stories that focus on a protagonist's relationship with himself are still stories that cannot escape the importance of other people's influence upon that protagonist. This means choosing the right relationships for your story is one of the most important decisions you will ever make for your story. Stories can feature multiple meaningful relationships, each an insightful commentary upon the others in an ever-deepening web of thematic complexity. However, even the most complex stories will almost always focus on one primary relationship that crystallizes the thematic premise and catalyzes the protagonist's personal growth. This is the relationship that defines the story, and it must be chosen with care. Think about it. Who is the primary relationship character in your work in progress? It might be a love interest, a parental figure, a best friend, even an antagonist. Now, consider what would happen if you shifted that focus to a different relationship character. It might make your story worse, might make your story better, but for certain, it would completely change your story. If you inadvertently choose to focus on a dead-end relationship, you will inevitably weaken your entire story, your protagonist's character arc, the potential of your premise, the purpose of your plot, and the persuasiveness of your theme. So, how do you know when you've accidentally bypassed your story's juiciest options and instead chosen a hapless dead-end relationship? Following are 5 likely signs. Sign number 1. The main relationship is boring. This isn't so much the cause as it is the effect, but it's the surest sign something has gone amiss somewhere along the line. The very nature of a dead-end relationship, static and without conflict, means it's never going to do much of interest. It just sits there on the page as the 2 main relationship characters perform a lot of purposeless rambling around while talking a whole lot about a whole lot of nothing. For example, tough girl Charlotte Maine was orphaned in the early days of World War II and grew up among the French resistance, which was headed by her father's crusty old buddy, Bonaparte. She loves old Beau like an uncle, and despite his occasional grumpiness of manner, he loves her right back. She pines, against her better judgment, for the apparent traitor Lieutenant Lafayette, and discusses it on a frequent basis with Beau, who does his best to tactfully advise her about what she should do if she ever meets poor Lieutenant yet again. Sign number 2. The main relationship isn't doing anything. The main reason a dead-end relationship is boring is because it isn't focused on forward progression within the plot. Because there's no dynamism within the relationship, it has no forward momentum, no ability to affect the plot in itself, and precious little likelihood of being affected by the plot. For example, every once in a while, Charlotte and Beau will go out and skirmish with the enemy. He'll give her a comforting pat on the shoulder. Maybe she'll even dare to affectionately kiss that shiny bald spot atop his head. They'll spend a couple scenes wondering together why Lieutenant Yet could have betrayed them. Then a couple more sleeping and eating between skirmishes. Then repeat. Sign number 3. The main relationship doesn't ask a question. The lack of dynamism in any relationship is usually because it asks no questions. For example, what a dead-end relationship does not do is ask questions such as, does he love me? Can I trust her? Why won't he ever talk about his childhood? Why does she always make me so spitting mad? And why does he have to want something different from what I want? In a dead-end relationship, the characters both feel they completely understand and can depend on each other. There are no mysteries here. There's no need to figure out the other person, which means there's no goal for either character within the relationship, which means there's no conflict, which means so what? For example, Charlotte understands good old Uncle Beau inside out, just as he, in his taciturn way, understands her. Not much to think about there. They're each quite comfortable in the knowledge that whatever may happen in the war, whatever that dastardly Lieutenant Yet may do next, they never have to worry about letting each other down. Sign number 3. The main relationship doesn't change. In a dead-end relationship, everything is always great. The characters like each other, get along, and are confident that the relationship will continue to provide for them just as it has always done. They might, if readers are lucky, be working toward a common goal, but the goal, its obstacles, and the resultant conflict are entirely exterior. The relationship between these characters will be no different at the end of the story than it was at the beginning. For example, Charlotte and Beau are a trusty team, fighting successfully alongside each other all book long until Lieutenant Yet shows up and, gasp, kills Uncle Beau. Charlotte is heartbroken. She holds poor bleeding Beau in her arms while he gasps out, "I love you, my dear," and then kicks the bucket. So, yeah, the external relationship did change. But aside from the fact that Charlotte is now really, really sad and really, really mad at Lieutenant Yet, her relationship with Uncle Beau didn't change a lick from beginning to end. There's no irony in his dying words, no unfinished business between them to haunt her or inspire her to be a changed person in the aftermath. Sign number 5. The main relationship character is static. It's kind of a chicken-egg thing. The main relationship character in a dead-end relationship is static because the relationship is static. And the relationship is static because the character is static. Dead-end relationships are almost always an indication that your minor characters are little more than cardboard cutouts, there to serve the external plot and give your protagonist a yes man to talk to. And that, in turn, is probably a sign your protagonist herself is edging dangerously near to being a too precious Mary Sue, who is never challenged in her beliefs or actions by any of the supporting characters or external plot events. For example, Old Beau is the quintessential soldier, gnarled, gruff, rough, tough, blustery, but with a heart of gold under it all. That's who he was back when he took his old war buddy's poor orphan daughter under his wing, and that's who he'll be to the day he dies. He brought Charlotte up to be his best soldier, and most of his advice for her these days is gruff praise for her accomplishments and bland admonishments that Lieutenant Yet never really deserved her anyway. She humbly demurs now and then, but mostly she believes him. So, by now, I hope you are well and properly scared of featuring a dead-end relationship too prominently in your story. But how can you make sure you've chosen the most dynamic duo for your story's main relationship? Start by answering these 5 questions. Number 1, which minor character do you like the most? Most of the time, the right relationship character will present himself up front. For me, my initial story ideas are almost always the result of 2 characters appearing center stage in my imagination and starting a conversation. But in the event you're not sure which of your awesome characters to choose, consider which you like the most. Which character will you enjoy spending the most time with? Which relationship dynamic will be the most fun to explore? But be careful. You might find yourself in love with the idea of the relationship more than the unique and individual character himself. For example, it's far too easy to write a vapid love interest and believe he's loverly just because he's Prince Charming. Good characters are always much more than the role they play. Question number 2. Which minor character is interesting enough to be a protagonist in her own right? Whenever you have a minor character so fascinating it's all you can do to keep her from taking over as protagonist in her own right, you can pretty much be sure you've got a wonderfully dynamic character on your hands. This is the kind of character who has ideas and goals of her own and will never be content to simply nod and smile for your protagonist's benefit. This is the kind of character who will create interesting relationships because she's already interesting in her own right. Question number 3. Which minor character is the best contrast and or mirror of your protagonist? Supporting characters exist to deepen your story's thematic argument. Even at their most individualistic and realistic, they are fundamentally archetypal symbols representing the different facets of your protagonist's journey via your theme. The main relationship character is the most important influence upon your protagonist's arc, which means you need to choose a character who is either a strong contrast or a mirror of who your protagonist was, is, or is becoming. When placed face to face with your protagonist, which of your supporting characters will inspire the deepest and most interesting questions about your theme? Question number 4. Which minor character will create conflict and growth? Do not choose a main relationship character whose chief function is to agree with your protagonist and tell him how wonderful he is. Even if the main relationship is a loving one, it should not be a fundamentally affirming one. You want to choose a relationship character who will create conflict, and as a result, inspire painful but necessary growth in your protagonist, and who, in turn, will probably experience reciprocal growth as well. This is relational dynamism. This is the kind of relationship that will not only be interesting in its own right, but which will forcefully and meaningfully impact your external plot. Question number 5. Which minor character is on stage the most? Finally, you will usually want to choose a relationship character who will be physically present and able to interact with your protagonist for most of the story. The Lieutenant Yet character from our examples may indeed have been a more interesting character than the well-meaning but flat Uncle Beau, but he never shared the stage with Charlotte until the very end. A relationship that is only talked about can't drive your story, however interesting it may be in its own right. Avoiding dead-end relationships will help you identify and eliminate countless other potential story killers, not least among them a dull plot, a lack of meaningful conflict, insipid characters, and flat themes. If you can take full advantage of your story's main relationship, you will be that much closer to taking full advantage of the story itself. Thank you for listening to the Wordplay Podcast. To read a transcript of this episode, you can visit my website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. And be sure to check back again next week.